In that evening, did you give to your kids something like Calpol to help them sleep?
We're not going to comment on anything, but, there is absolutely no way we used any sedative drugs or anything like that. And, we have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries.
What happens when a child disappears and the search for truth turns into something else? Something colder, something calculated? The disappearance of Madeleine McCann has haunted the world for nearly 2 decades. Posters, press conferences, televised appeals, all painting a portrait of a little girl stolen in the night. Yet, beneath the public story lies a trail of contradictions, silences, and details that refuse to vanish. This is not only a case about a missing child, it is a case about narrative, control, and the devastating possibility that what the world was told is not what truly happened. On May 3, 2007, the seaside town of Praia da Luz in Portugal was filled with holiday laughter. The McCanns, doctors by profession, were on vacation with friends. Their routine seemed innocent. Every evening, the adults dined together while the children slept in nearby apartments. No babysitters, no supervision, just occasional checks. That night, however, the system broke. At least, that was the story. Madeleine, only 3 years old, was gone. From the very beginning, something about the case did not feel right. There were no signs of forced entry, no cries heard in the night, no evidence of an intruder slipping silently past. Instead, what emerged was a carefully managed narrative, one that spoke loudly in public, but quietly erased uncomfortable facts. Witnesses disagreed on details, timelines overlapped strangely, and objects as ordinary as a tennis bag or a refrigerator suddenly carried the weight of suspicion. And then came the silence, the refusal to answer 48 direct police questions, the legal teams hired within days, the photographs altered beyond investigative use. Parents are supposed to break down, to beg, to demand. Here, the behavior felt rehearsed, staged, almost like theater. This story begins not with the image of a stranger in the dark, but with a quieter, more haunting possibility. That an accident occurred, and from that moment forward, everything was about concealment. The search for Madeleine became a campaign, a brand, while the truth slipped further into the shadows. And as we peel back the layers of silence, the question remains. Was this really a kidnapping or the beginning of one of the greatest cover-ups of our time? The evening began like so many others during that holiday. The group of friends, later known as the Tapas 9, gathered at the resort's restaurant, a short walk from their apartments. Plates clattered, wine glasses sparkled, laughter echoed across the terrace. Inside apartment 5A, however, the McCann children lay asleep. At least, that was the version of events everyone was meant to believe. The so-called checking system was simple. Every 20 to 30 minutes, one of the adults would excuse themselves, walk back to their apartment, peek inside, and return to the table. On the surface, it gave the impression of responsibility, but behind that routine lurked questions. Who really saw the children? Who confirmed Madeleine was safe after breakfast that day? Outside the group, no one could say for certain. Jerry McCann, a doctor, understood medicine. Theories suggest that on that night, as on others before, the children may have been given a mild sedative to keep them asleep while the adults enjoyed their evening undisturbed. A tablet, a few drops, harmless, some might think. But sedatives are unpredictable, especially with small children. Too much, or simply a unique reaction, can tip the balance between calm and catastrophe. Imagine Madeleine stirring awake. She is groggy, unsteady, perhaps trying to reach the sofa by the window, as she often did. Her little body, dulled by the medication, cannot balance. One slip, one fall, and the holiday night turns into tragedy. At that moment, Jerry is the first to find her. What should have been a cry of panic, a desperate call for help, becomes something else entirely. Instead of dialing emergency services, he calls Kate. Together, in those few charged minutes, they make a decision. Not to grieve, not to explain, but to conceal. Fear floods in, not just fear of losing Madeleine, but of losing their other children, their careers, their freedom. An accident, exposed, could destroy everything. From here, the story shifts. The grieving parents the world would later see were, in that moment, problem solvers. Cold, strategic, already considering what to do next. The cover-up begins with small actions. where to place the body, how to make the scene appear untouched, whether to stage her on the couch with her toy cuddle cat. But soon they realize that nothing will hold. And so, another plan begins to form. The night of May 3rd was not chaos. It was choreography. It was not a desperate search for a missing child. It was the first step in a long, deliberate effort to rewrite the truth. Every cover-up leaves behind traces, and in the days following Madeleine's disappearance, small but telling details began to surface. They were not the dramatic clues of a cinematic kidnapping. No shattered windows, no muddy footprints, no forced locks. Instead, they were quieter, more unsettling, like whispers of what really happened inside apartment 5A. One of the most striking anomalies was the disappearance of a large blue tennis bag. Before May 3rd, this bag was clearly visible in photographs. It was big enough to hold sports equipment or the body of a small child. After that night, the bag was never seen again. When questioned, the McCanns denied ever owning such an item, despite photographic evidence proving otherwise. Why deny something so ordinary unless it was tied to something extraordinary? Then came the dogs. Specially trained British cadaver dogs were brought to Portugal weeks later. Their noses were not fooled by appearances or excuses. They reacted strongly inside the McCann apartment, most notably to the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom. They alerted again to Kate's clothing and, most hauntingly, to Madeleine's soft toy, Cuddle Cat, the very object Kate was often seen clutching in public as a symbol of maternal grief. To the dogs, however, it carried another scent, the unmistakable chemical signature of death. This finding raised disturbing questions. Why would a child's favorite toy, handled daily, bear the trace of decomposition? Why would the parents' clothing do the same? To investigators, it suggested that after Madeleine's death, she had been in close contact with these objects, long enough for the scent to transfer. The pattern continued with the family car. Although it would not be rented until weeks later, both cadaver and blood dogs later alerted to the trunk of the vehicle. But even before the car entered the story, the clues inside the apartment were damning enough. A wardrobe that should have smelled only of fabric carried the shadow of a lifeless body. Every piece of evidence seemed to point not outward, toward an intruder, but inward, toward concealment, a vanished bag, a contaminated toy, clothes that whispered of contact with the dead. These were not signs of abduction. They were signs of a desperate attempt to manage a tragedy, to keep a story intact. What began as a single choice, to hide rather than confess, now grew roots in the physical world. No matter how carefully the McCanns controlled their narrative, objects spoke in ways words could not. And those objects told a darker truth. Madeleine had not been stolen from her bed. She had been hidden. When a life is lost, time becomes the enemy. In the warmth of Portugal, decomposition begins quickly, leaving little chance to delay the inevitable. Yet the McCann case reveals a strange detail, one that suggests time was not left to run its natural course. Weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, Jerry McCann wrote a blog post mentioning the replacement of a refrigerator at a rented villa. At first glance, it seemed trivial, a passing comment about a household inconvenience. But in a case like this, nothing is trivial. The post was later deleted, raising a troubling question. Why would a father, in the middle of a global search for his missing daughter, choose to write about a fridge and then erase it? The suspicion is chilling. If Madeleine's body had been temporarily placed inside cold storage, decomposition would have slowed. It would have given the McCanns precious time to plan, to think, to wait for the right moment to move her again. The missing tennis bag could have carried her out of the apartment. The fridge could have hidden her until the chaos of the first days subsided. And consider the timing. Jerry's blog referenced replacing the fridge in late May, more than 3 weeks after Madeleine vanished. By then, the initial frenzy had passed, the cameras had shifted focus, and the McCanns had relocated to another villa. A broken refrigerator removed quietly to a dump by Jerry himself, without the involvement of a landlord or technician, is not routine, it is deliberate. This detail might have been forgotten had it not been erased. The deletion of the blog post makes it more than suspicious. People erase what threatens them. They erase what could connect dots. The refrigerator stands as a symbol in this story. Not proof in itself, but a gap that fits too neatly into the chain of missing links. A vanished bag, a contaminated toy, a wardrobe that smelled of death, and now, a fridge that was mentioned, then silenced. Each piece alone raises questions. Together, they draw a line between an accident and a cover-up carefully managed in stages. The night of May 3rd may have ended with Madeleine's death, but what followed was a campaign to stretch time, to buy silence, to hold back truth for as long as possible. And in the cold hum of a refrigerator, the cover-up found its first pause. 25 days after Madeleine disappeared, the McCanns rented a silver Renault Scenic. On the surface, it was just another family car, unremarkable, practical, forgettable. Yet this vehicle would soon become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. In early August, British cadaver dogs were brought to Portugal. These were not ordinary sniffer dogs. They were specialists trained to detect the unique scent of human decomposition. When released around the McCanns' belongings, their reactions were chillingly precise. The dogs alerted to specific locations, not randomly, but repeatedly. The wardrobe in apartment 5A, Kate's clothing, Madeleine's toy, and then, unmistakably, the Renault Scenic. One dog reacted strongly to the driver's side door and the trunk. The other, trained to detect blood, confirmed the finding. This was no coincidence. 2 dogs, 2 different skills, both pointing to the same vehicle. Inside the trunk, investigators also found small traces of blood, not enough for conviction, but enough to raise suspicion. How could this be? If Madeleine had truly been abducted by a stranger on May 3rd, why would her scent and blood appear in a car rented by her parents almost a month later? The McCanns offered explanations: dirty diapers, spoiled meat, household trash. But cadaver dogs do not alert to food waste or baby hygiene. They respond only to the chemical markers of death, a scent so distinct and so enduring that handlers describe it as unforgettable. Neighbors added another disturbing detail. They noticed the trunk of the Renault Scenic left open at times during the summer heat. In Portugal's sweltering nights, why would anyone leave a trunk open unless trying to air out a smell that could not be scrubbed away? The timeline fits too neatly to ignore. If Madeleine's body had been hidden temporarily, perhaps in cold storage, the rented car provided the means for a final move. The dogs detected what human eyes could not erase, a lingering presence that science confirms, but words cannot excuse. Even more telling was the McCanns' reaction. They did not welcome further testing. They did not say, "Search again, prove us innocent." Instead, they questioned the dogs, attacked the reliability of forensic methods, and hired lawyers to challenge the very tools that had uncovered truths in countless other cases. The Renault Scenic was not simply a car. It was a vessel that carried the weight of suspicion, a silent witness to what may have been Madeleine's final journey. And like the missing tennis bag and the deleted blog post, it became one more link in a chain, pointing away from abduction and toward concealment. Behind every story are those who choose to speak and those who choose to remain silent. In the McCann case, the silence of the Tapas group has always been one of the most haunting elements. 7 friends, doctors, and professionals, all present on that holiday, all bound by the same timeline, and yet not one of them ever broke from the script. The group insisted they had a system. Each adult took turns checking on their children every 15 to 30 minutes. At first, this sounded reasonable, even reassuring, but the details soon began to crumble. The times they claimed were too neat, too perfectly spaced, almost like a rehearsed schedule. Who confirmed these checks? No waiter, no staff member, no other guest ever recalled the constant flow of parents leaving the table. Outside of their own statements, there was no proof that these checks even happened. Then came the contradictions. Jane Tanner swore she saw a man carrying a small child near 9:15 p.m., a sighting that became central to the abduction theory. But later, Irish tourist Martin Smith reported seeing a man around 10 p.m. carrying a child who eerily resembled Jerry McCann himself. His statement directly clashed with the group's narrative. The McCanns embraced Jane's story. It supported their version, but ignored the Smith sighting entirely. Even more troubling was how tightly the group closed ranks. When Portuguese police invited them back for further questioning, several refused. No one contradicted the official account. No one admitted uncertainty. Their silence was not neutral, it was protective. Whether out of loyalty, guilt, or fear, they chose to uphold one story. And while silence grew louder, lawyers and PR agents arrived. Within days of Madeleine's disappearance, the McCanns had hired one of the most expensive legal teams in the UK, Alongside them came Clarence Mitchell, a government-connected media spokesman whose job was not to search for a child, but to manage a narrative. What began as a tragedy increasingly looked like a campaign. The Tapas group may not have all known the truth, but their coordinated silence built a wall around the McCanns. And behind that wall, the story of abduction lived on, while the truth struggled to breathe. From the earliest hours after Madeleine's disappearance, something unusual unfolded. This was not treated as a standard missing child investigation. It became a matter of state, with layers of influence and image management that went far beyond the walls of Apartment 5A. Within hours, the British government was involved, not just consular staff, but high-ranking officials. Diplomats arrived in Portugal before they were even formally requested. Soon after, the McCanns secured a powerful legal team and the services of Clarence Mitchell, a former head of the UK government's media monitoring unit. His task was not to comb beaches or forests, but to craft a message. Madeleine was abducted, the parents were victims, and all other possibilities should be dismissed. The media complied. Headlines screamed abduction. Television programs framed the McCanns as grieving figures of sympathy. When cadaver dogs alerted to death, the story shifted to their supposed unreliability. When inconsistencies in the timeline surfaced, critics were painted as cruel conspiracists. Journalists who raised questions faced legal threats or professional isolation. The result was a narrative polished so carefully that it began to feel less like tragedy and more like theater. Then came the silencing of dissent. Portuguese investigator Gonçalo Amaral, who followed the evidence toward the McCanns themselves, was removed from the case. His book, based on official police files, was banned and discredited. He was painted as bitter and dishonest, not because his evidence was weak, but because his conclusions did not fit the story that had been chosen. Meanwhile, the McCanns' public image was curated with precision. Photographs of Kate holding Cuddle Cat circulated worldwide. Press conferences were carefully staged, interviews rehearsed, every answer measured. It was less the language of grieving parents and more the strategy of crisis managers. And still, the central question remained unanswered. Where was Madeleine? The narrative controlled perception, but it never produced truth. In the end, this case became larger than one child. It became an example of how media, politics, and influence can shape what the world believes. A vanished tennis bag, a deleted blog post, a car that smelled of death. All buried beneath the weight of a story, protected at the highest levels. Madeleine McCann did not need branding. She needed truth. But truth was the one thing the world was never allowed to fully hear.